Hello and welcome to the Coralosophy Podcast, a weekly podcast whose mission is multifaceted. Each week when you tune in, you will find episodes that question best practices, challenge music education dogma, facilitate conversations about touchy topics, demonstrate pedagogies, and conversations where colleagues learn from each other. This is episode 264, Education's Race to the Bottom of the Brainstem. Now, I did not coin this phrase. I borrowed it from former Google executive Tristan Harris. He's the maker of the Netflix documentary The Social Dilemma, in case you've seen that. Social media companies are trying to outcompete the others for attention by appealing to ever more primal drives within each person, dragging human cognition down the brainstem instead of cultivating critical thought. Is education falling into the same trap? On Facebook, X, and Substack this week, I posted some thoughts that started a lot of conversation. Maybe the most unhealthy thing we teach teachers is that if the cheap dopamine-addicted teens in their room are not brimming with excitement during your class, that you are, quote, failing to engage them, as if students do not bear any responsibility for their own engagement. This belief causes teachers to seek to gamify instruction, find gimmicks, cut corners, dumb down, and reduce the load. But more tragically, it causes young teachers with potential to be great teachers to give up and change professions. The reality is, it is not a fair expectation for teachers to compete with the entertainment value of their cell phone and video games. With quality instruction, oftentimes the dopamine hit may take days or weeks to finally drop. This should be encouraged, supported by administrators and parents, and then reinforced with those expectations when kids come to school. Now, this issue has come up on the channel before. First, in my review a few years back of the Anxious Generation book, which is the book that has led really to a lot of these cell phone bans that are going on around the country. And I did a review of that when it first came out. I would go back and check that out. And for many concerned colleagues about this issue since. So in this episode, we dive into that colleague conversation that has been stirred up online and discuss strategies and possible solutions in your classroom, including some of my ideas, but also some that I found in that now ever-growing post with tons and tons of colleague ideas and contributions that are going on in there. So stay tuned. And of course, you can always head over to the Coralosophy Facebook page and add your ideas and your observations about the way kids be these days, and we can talk about it more there as well. Your music program or event deserves a platform that does it all, without the extra costs. With Ludus, you get seamless ticketing, built-in marketing, powerful fundraising, and volunteer management, where volunteers can sign up, schedule shifts, and track hours with ease. Need to sell merchandise and concessions in person? Ludus Retail lets you log sales by each group, track inventory, keep everything organized. Hosting music lessons or theater camps? They have a classes feature, which makes registration and student tracking effortless. And it's free for your organization. Thousands of programs already trust Ludus because they help you focus on what matters most, the performance. If you haven't already, I really think it's time for you to ditch the bulky sight reading books, the paper, all of the things that are already in the kids' folders in your classroom because it's not customizable to what they need in the moment. Sight Reading Factory allows this and so much more, including auto-assessment for at-home assignments, no more grading them individually. They can be graded in the moment. So use the Coralosophy checkout code, Coralosophy. When you check out, it'll give you a 10% discount every time you get a membership for yourself and for all of your students, which is really, really important so they can do this at home. I'm not sure how much, if anything, out there has not gone up in price since 2020, but I know one thing that hasn't, and that is the membership to the Patreon and to the Substack to support this show. The people who are signed up over there as paid subscribers, as my thank you to them, they can get things like t-shirts from the Coralosophy.com shop. They can also get access to my Google folder of teaching materials that I've talked about on the show for over the years. And of course, they just want to help make sure that this show can continue. And one of those benefits is a shout out on the show. Shout outs for the Inner Circle and producer tiers over on Patreon. We have Brian Long, Chandler Smith, Venture Studios, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Max Jackson, Michael Herron, Rebecca Chalk, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. All right, everybody, so I am sitting in my car with the engine off. It's like a great little sound studio out here. I'm outside of my son's baseball lesson because the fall baseball season is done, and I get to pass him on to some other coaches to work on some skills. And it's been a really busy fall for me with baseball, coaching baseball, the musical at school, of course, the podcast, church job, all the things. And so I'm now feeling that post baseball season and musical is winding down just a little bit, and I can relax and I can find some space. However, I'm still a dad, so I got to drive around and do podcasts in the car sometimes. And that's just a little bit about what my life's like that you might not know if all you ever do is listen to this show and occasionally check in on Instagram or on Facebook. So that's what I'm doing right now, and just hanging out in the car. And I made a post on Facebook this week that I kind of labeled as the race to the bottom of the brainstem in education. And it is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. And I know a lot of you have too, because that post is still, as we speak, just dinging over there on Facebook and being shared, and almost all in a very positive context, because I think the nerve that it struck is this. We as teachers I feel like, are being pressured into a false belief. And that false belief is that it is our job to convince kids that they should want to know the things that we are teaching them. And that it is our job to be so sparklingly magical and a Pied Piper that we just pull them out of their dopamine-addicted cell phone stupor and are so entertaining and interesting that they're willing to put down their phone, which, keep in mind, is a chemical addiction, that they are addicted to how exciting that phone feels to them because of the literally designed to do it, pumping their brains full of injections of large amounts of dopamine that they have to do no work to achieve. And we're supposed to compete with that. And guys, we can't. There is no mechanism for us to be that exciting and still deliver education in a meaningful way when you consider how difficult it is to learn how to do things well, right? I'm thinking of any of us who know, like, if we practice an instrument to become really good at it, we know how much slow, painful concentration work has to happen. Well, guys, that slow, painful concentration work does not have a dopamine payoff. It might, like 6 months down the road, that kid might finally get that dopamine payoff, but what they're used to in this generation is they are used to scroll, ding, scroll, ding, with shots of dopamine into the brain every few seconds, and putting down the phone and coming into our class is like torture. And it doesn't matter. It like literally like a drug addict I want to make sure this is super clear. They are drug addicts. Anyone who is addicted to a phone is addicted to a substance. It's not a device. They are addicted to the substance that is pumped into their brain by the device's design. That is what it's designed to do. Okay, you can tell this is something I'm just lit up about this these days, because the way I think that this is affecting education, because it's causing young teachers to believe that if they aren't more entertaining than the phone, then they are a bad teacher and they're quitting, because this is where a lot of the behavior issues that teachers are complaining about come from, is the kids are bored. But it's not because the teachers are boring. These teachers would have been great 20 years ago, because the kids coming into the room would have had a lower expectation chemically for how much dopamine should hit their brain in any given 45 minutes. Their expectation for how high that dose needs to be for them to feel like they're enjoying themselves is way too high to be healthy. Okay, so that's the purpose. That was the underlying undertone of my post. And then another layer to that post on Facebook, and this is on the Choral Podcast Facebook page, not my personal page. It's just it's also, I put it on Twitter too, because I interact with a lot of teachers, non-music teachers there on Twitter, on X. I guess what I would call a toxic incentive structure, where teachers are being led to believe that this is our job. It is our job to convince the kid that they want to learn all those really hard, painful concentration things from us. And if we can't convince them to do it, then that means that we didn't make it relevant for them. We didn't make it student-centered enough for them. We didn't ask them what they wanted to learn. There is all of this going on. Okay. And so again, that creates a situation where we have now moved education to more of a customer service model of education, where the kids, they're not dumb. They know this is going on at some level, and so do their parents. And so then that shifts the responsibility back onto the teacher 100%. For me as a student, then I'm 15, I get to walk into a class and sit there and go, oh yeah, what do you got for me? Make it worth my time. And it gives this attitude that the student bears no responsibility at all to come into a classroom and have their own internal source of motivation that says, I need to learn this stuff because being a good student is important, and I need to be good at learning, and I need to be good at acquiring new skills, and this teacher is going to help me acquire some new skills. What can I do to try to learn this material? Now, of all of that being said, do you hear me saying that teachers shouldn't have to engage students. You do not hear me saying that. Am I saying that students should not make their class fun? Or teachers should not make their class fun? I am not saying that at all. Teachers should work to make their environments fun, engaging, creating various incentive structures within the class, sometimes extrinsic motivators to get kids who are not motivated to get moving on the process. But the goal has to be intrinsic motivation, and the goal has to be independent learning, that the student at some point will have to decide that is something that they want to do. They want to be an active participant in the learning. They can't be a passenger princess. And that is true in a choir rehearsal. That's my subject. But I also teach music appreciation, where this is a real problem. Okay, so what I'm suggesting with this post is that it's not only the teacher's only job to motivate the student. Teachers should try to motivate students, but some of that responsibility is on the student. Now, yes, lots of people on that post commented about, well, what about the parents? What about culture? What about society, etc.? All of those things, yes. It's everybody's job to contribute to that, but still, what percentage in your mind should be the student's responsibility? And I would say it can't be zero. That's really kind of that's my limiting principle on this. I'm not saying it should be all the student. I'm not saying that a kid who's had a really rough go of things in their life is going to have the capacity to come into a classroom and just self-motivate. That's not what I'm saying. But still, in any circumstance, and this is again from a person who experienced a lot of childhood trauma and things that pulled my motivation away from school for large portions of my childhood, I still had to figure it out. Like, I had to figure out where that spark in me is. And when we take all of that responsibility, that agency away from kids, we rob them of the ability to find that spark in themselves. Self-esteem. That's another great buzzword. Teachers can't give self-esteem to kids. It's got self right in the name. You can't other person esteem someone. If the whole concept of self-esteem is self-esteem, something that you hold in esteem, you've got to do it yourself. You can't have someone else do that for you. And I think that is also true of learning. So for the rest of this episode, I'll probably be recording in my home studio again, and I'm going to go through some of the comments on this post that I think are really interesting to add to this, because there were lots of people who made lots of really good points. And this post has been for the most part, very productive. Of course, it's the internet, so there's always going to be people who misunderstood it or read it in bad faith or read in things that I didn't say, those types of things. That always happens, and I'm accustomed to that, and that's par for the course. But I think there's some really great nuggets of helpful ways for us to think about this. And I think that in order for us to make headway in education in the United States, we're going to have to figure out a game plan for teachers, because nowadays, of course, recently, cell phone bans are coming throughout many states in the United States, of banning cell phones at schools, and I am fully in support of that. It's been great at my school. We're in now year 2 of no phones, and it has changed a lot of things for the better. But it's not going to fix it, because they're only at school for 8 hours, and they're still rocking up 4 or 5 or 6 hours of screen time on average when they're not at school. And that dopamine addiction persists, and we need a detox. So stick around. We're going to dig into some more of these concepts later, and hopefully arrive at some type of action plan for you in your classroom, but also in your school districts and communities. Okay, before we get over to the colleague conversation, I'm going to start by setting up some framework here. So in my post that I read in the intro, you can of course go to Facebook if you'd like to read it. I'm not going to read it again here. I use some terms, and those terms probably should get defined just to make sure that we are all kind of thinking of this in the same way. So the first one is engagement, of course. What does it mean to be engaged? Number one, so those of you who've listened to my grading episodes know that that's a pillar of my grading philosophy, is that I'm actually grading engagement. So who gets to define what engagement actually looks like? Is it the student? Is it the teacher? Or is it the system evaluating them? Now, of course, in my world, that's me or the teachers that teach the kids. They are the ones who decide what engagement looks like, because we are the experts in that area. So for me as a teacher of music and somebody who is going to do music learning in my class, the students wouldn't know how to show what engagement looks like because they've never learned music before. So I have to set those parameters. And for me, that looks like, if we're reading music, that means where our eyes are. Are we actually looking at the stuff we're trying to learn how to read? If we're talking about learning how to sing kinesthetically, are you fully physically engaged? Because you can be physically engaged and mentally engaged in the learning, etc. Now, That's an oversimplification. You can go listen to my grading episodes if you want to. But the point is, in a classroom environment, I believe the teacher needs to define what engagement is, because it can't be democratized in that sense, or everybody's grading themselves. And then we have bias problems happening from students grading themselves. So that's one. You can have your own answers to that. That's just my answer. Another question: have we replaced intellectual engagement with emotional entertainment at school? And I think that's an important question to answer. And I don't know that I have the entire answer to that. I would say in some cases, yes, that we have replaced as an expectation for students that they be intellectually engaged with all their activities, and replaced it with, are we feeling like we like this, which is not the same and not necessarily the role of a school, I would argue. So here's another engagement prompt, and I want you to see what you think. How has social media's instant feedback loop shaped what students and even administrators think that learning should feel like, especially for those old fogies like myself who might have administrators who are 15 years younger than them or 20 years younger than them in some cases? Has that expectation for what that regular cycle of feedback of, I try a thing, I do it, I get the high five. I try it, I do it, I get the high five. I get that ding, ding, ding of the dopamine whenever I hit those quick cycles. Now, you can learn a lot that way, but there are a lot of things you cannot learn that way. Sometimes you have to go through slower cycles for different things. I would argue, like playing the piano or singing. You might have to work in frustrating loops that go without a dopamine hit for a month or two. So has social media's model for creating that expectation for how quickly we are rewarded, like rats with cheese, for our success, has that impacted the way school is operating? Is there a moral difference between engaging through curiosity versus engaging through stimulation? Am I prompting you to be curious, or am I encouraging the curiosity and then you do the digging? So some other things from my post that might be worth unpacking on the psychology of learning. Are we undervaluing delayed gratification as a legitimate part of learning motivation? Of course, it will surprise no one who listens to this show that the answer for me is yes. We are undervaluing delayed gratification. And if the kid is bored, I think a lot of teachers are getting the message that that's their fault, that you should have been more fun. You should have been more engaging. You should have provided more cheese for the rat. And I think that's a dangerous trap to go down. At one point in a professional development at my school, I made some teachers not super happy in the room because an administrator asked, what does it take to be successful at our school? And asked for all the teachers to come up and write their ideas on the board of like, what does a student need to know how to do to be successful in our school? And this was all the teachers in the building. And everybody goes up and writes their answers. And I thought about it. And I was, of course, not being intentionally snide, but it was not well received by everyone in the room, although I did get a lot of high fives when I left the room. I went up on the board and I wrote, a student needs to know in our building to be successful how to click all the buttons until they turn green. And then I put the marker down and walked away, and everybody looked at me funny. Okay, so that was awkward, but it was true. And I talked to a lot of teachers about that afterward. That sparked a conversation of, oh my goodness, is that what we're really doing? And that, of course, was a pandemic era thing where everything was a Google form. Everything was a school learning software delivered thing. And a lot of times it was, you can turn this in as many times as you want until you get the grade you want. And so, of course, what did kids start to do? They just started to click through the form and submit randomly. And then when they get the bad grade, they click in a bunch of other answers until all the lights turn green, and then they hit submit, they get their 100%. But did they learn anything? Of course not. They learned how to do the form. And I think that's, in a lot of places, that's where a lot of kids are right now. So that's a learning psychology thing. We're teaching them to believe that they've learned. Here's another question. So how do we help students recognize that boredom can be a necessary precondition to deep focus or discovery? How do we teach them to love it? For me, in music context, that looks like a lot of individual sitting there with your music until you've figured it out. That could look like audiation. That could look like writing in solfege syllables for the true beginner. That could look like a class period like my kids had today, where we didn't get very far in the music because it was painfully slow, because the kids were doing it on their own, completely on their own. And that is a hump, a hurdle that they all have to get over at a certain point. But then they can learn to look back on that struggle and really appreciate it. And I think that's a lesson then they take out of my class into the future. And we can all give them that gift of giving them the gift of looking back at their boredom and going, wow, but I got something out of that. That was really important. Here's another question. Could the short-term engagement chase actually reduce long-term retention and critical thinking? I think it can. I want to know some of your answers, though. I'm just going to post these questions as part of this episode discussion and see if we can get some good answers from colleagues as well. What does the research actually say about intrinsic motivation when compared with dopamine-driven reward cycles? For that, I would send you to people like Scott Barry Kaufman, who's been on this show and is a leading researcher in the world related to motivation theory and what motivates people to do things. And I'll give you a hint. In the long term, it's not dopamine. Because if it were dopamine, you would have to continue to pump it in and to continue to pump it in. It's an addiction. So then the other layer of my post that we should address here real quick is how this impacts teacher burnout. Because I do believe that there is a pressure that comes very explicitly in more recent teacher training. And it comes through things like, you're going to hear lots of buzzwords for it. It's going to come from student-centered learning, which sounds really great until you read any of it. Other things like inquiry-based learning. Sounds really great unless you read some of it. And then you start to think about things like, well, but how do students who have never learned how to do anything in this subject area know enough to inquire about what they will learn? How can they be asking the teacher for certain pathways through that subject if they know nothing about the subject? They are going blindfolded into the forest. So inquiry-based, for example, I've done a lot of reading about that. Inquiry-based learning is very trendy in school districts in the United States right now. And I don't have any issues philosophically with that model, but not for beginners. Beginners need to be explicitly taught, directly taught, how to do the thing. You've got to know how to do the thing before you can do inquiry. And so that's a really important thing. And there's been episodes I've done with other non-music teachers on that on the show as well. And so that's really, really important. So student-centered learning sometimes gets framed as the students should be telling us also what they want to learn. And since they're bored, it's probably because we didn't make it relevant to them by doing the music, in our case, that they like. I just think that is so incredibly misguided. Because if we are framing our curriculum based around things that they already knew about and knew how to do before they walked into our classroom, then I would argue that we aren't teaching them anything. We are showing them a mirror to themselves. And that's a really good way to not teach music, number one, but it's also a really good way to cultivate narcissism in a population. Is if when I walk into the school, I start to expect it to show me a mirror that reflects everything that I am, and that I'm trying to see myself in the curriculum, which is another buzzword. And people know I've talked about that too. I don't like that. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think we should be giving people a curriculum that they can see themselves in. Not to say that it's bad to ever see yourself in the curriculum, but I think a more important thing for kids to learn is how to see each other in the curriculum, how to see others in their curriculum, because that leads to empathy. If all I ever show you is you, that's going to breed narcissism. So to me, that might be a philosophical semantics for some of you to hear that. I don't know, but that concerns me. And I think that's related to this idea of kids coming into classrooms feeling like, if you don't entertain me, if you don't teach me the stuff I like, then I'm going to check out and I'm going to be bored and I'm going to fail your class. And guess whose fault everyone's going to think that is? It's yours, teacher, because you failed to engage me. You failed to meet me where I am, as another buzz term, and then inspire me to learn. And all of those things that I'm describing, again, it's nuance, right? And I said this before, but should kids sometimes see themselves in the curriculum? Yes, but should that be the main reason we have the curriculum? I would argue no. That should be one of the happy accidents that happens sometimes at school. And that the thing we learn is how to see our common humanity in all the arts and humanities curriculums that we teach. So the crucial thing that I'm trying to communicate here is that we are teaching a generation of teachers to center a customer service form of education, which takes what we do and removes ourselves as the expert in the room and places us as a server, like a waiter at a restaurant. And I don't think that's a road we really want to go down. Are you a director new to the profession? Or are you a seasoned director who is in a new place? One of my favorite tips for generating interest in the program and to instill buy-in is to plan a trip. There are so many options. You can go to Orlando, you can go to Ireland, or you can perform in a parade or a theme park. You can even take the stage at Carnegie Hall in New York. Wherever you end up, not only will your current crew look forward to the trip, but younger students will count the days until it's their turn to go. If you have no idea where to start, Connect with Kaleidoscope Adventures at mykatrip.com. Okay, now we're going over to this Facebook thread. This is fantastic. We're looking at probably 100,000 views on this post so far. And I love it. It's interesting because whenever I post things, I've said this on the show before, but I have no way to predict. Like I post stuff all the time. Sometimes I post something and I go grab a helmet and hide under a desk because I'm afraid I'm going to offend somebody. And then they're crickets. Like nobody responds. It's just nothing. And then sometimes I post the most innocuous thing that I think isn't controversial at all. And somebody gets mad and starts sharing it around and as some horrible thing that I said. And then sometimes it's somewhere in between. And this post, I was just sitting around reading blogs about education in the morning on a day that I was supervising kids at their honor choir event. And I was thinking a lot about some conversations that I've been reading from other teachers about this kind of engagement farming model of education where we have to essentially plug kids in as if they don't have any responsibility for plugging themselves in. Do they have some kind of installed from their parents, of course, yes, from society, but also from the way that administrators and school districts expect students to behave? And if you don't, there will be certain types of consequences. All of those layers need to be there in order for this to work. And I was thinking a lot about that before I wrote this post. And so, of course, there are a lot of really interesting reactions to it and being shared a lot of times with lots of comments. So I'm not going to be able to read all of it here, but I want to highlight some that are really interesting. So one of the top comments on here is as follows, and I'm not going to use names. If you want to go through and read things, you can go through and read things, but I'm not going to call people out by name, agree or disagree. But from a colleague who says, the problem is conflating fun, entertainment, and engagement. I do expect music classes to be engaging. This means students actively listening, making choices, and giving input. This requires directors to limit authoritarian practices. If the entire class consists of enacting the director's will as though the students were simply music-making widgets in the large ensemble machine, many students will find it disengaging. Less authoritarian approaches involve letting students help make musical decisions, find mistakes, and lead parts of the rehearsals or sectionals. This is me again interjecting. You all know how I feel about that. That is huge. A lot about music classes can be fun and entertaining, but that's a side effect of authentic engagement. Extrinsic motivators and gamification have incredibly limited scope and can distract from deeper and more authentic musical motivations. And of course, I replied, it sounds like we agree, because that post was exactly how I would say it. Like, this is very, very similar to my philosophy, with maybe one exception. I would only probably nitpick the language of directors using authoritarian practices. There are directors who do that, but that does not fairly describe the large ensemble model in general. It is not authoritarian to run a tight rehearsal. It is not authoritarian for a director to set an agenda in a rehearsal. So there's some nuance there. I personally would not choose a word like authoritarian that comes with a lot of emotional baggage that is negative. I would choose to explain that differently. I would choose to emphasize the other stuff that this person said, which is student-led sectionals, student error detection, student decision-making in terms of musical ideas and elements. So yes, this is exactly what I'm getting at, is that sometimes we create actually the impression that the students are going to have more fun and be engaged ironically, by having directors just do all the stuff for them. And that makes it look like they're having fun right away and that they're involved and engaged, but that's not authentic engagement, as this poster said. So I thought that was really good. But not everybody liked this post. Here's another one that says, I have never so wholeheartedly disagreed with a post than this one. Gamified instruction is a sound instructional practice, especially for early elementary. Let's meet kids where they're at. Well, there's the buzz term. It's true students are responsible for their learning, but let's do our part to create those conditions. Okay, now, of course, this would be an example of somebody reading something into it that I didn't say. So I am not saying teachers should not do their part. What I'm saying is that we too rarely talk about what the student's part is at all in this engagement piece. How much of it is their responsibility? That's essentially what I'm asking. And I asked this person, but didn't really get a super strong reply of what percentage is the kid's responsibility. That's really all I'm coming from here. That's where I'm trying to get. But something he said there, which is interesting, is that gamified instruction is a sound instructional practice, especially for early elementary. Now, of course, my post was about teens, but I'm happy to talk about early elementary. Gamification of education really just means that you are replacing the traditional style of lesson with some type of learning activity that has game elements to it, but you're not playing an entire game. So it could be as simple as just asking a bunch of questions and awarding some points on the board for who gets the most questions. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. My concern is when we replace the deeper learning and the pedagogies that lead to higher order critical thinking with gamification to show that kids are doing something, quote unquote, doing something. So the idea is that when gamified instruction is happening, kids do appear to be very engaged because they're getting those ding, ding, ding dopamine hits. Of course they look engaged. But engagement is not a proxy for learning. Showing that a kid is engaged does not mean you've actually shown that they are learning anything. They can just be having fun, which is fine. And all of those things are fine as long as it leads to that more authentic engagement at some point. I would say at some point quickly. Any gamification should lead quickly into authentic engagement. Another colleague says it's also okay for them to be bored. Sometimes things in school and life are just boring. Kids today really aren't that much different. Kids have always found parts of school to be dull. The expectation that they stay engaged 100% of the time is what has really changed. That's a really good point. And I guess kind of part of my point is that we shouldn't expect it and we shouldn't judge teachers by their ability to do it. And that's actually a big part of teacher evaluations. You can get a bad evaluation because an administrator walks into the room at a time when kids are not engaged, and that counts against you. Shows on paper that you're not a very good teacher. And I think that is part of this toxic expectation that I'm talking to. And some teachers say things like, I just really needed to hear this today. The expectation for games all week during Halloween is exhausting. That's a great example. And this comment is really interesting because it's something I had not thought about prior to this comment, but this is a really good point. Another colleague says, then you add in going class to class, like in middle school or high school. It feels like we are all competing with the last show. I'm a professional musician. I can read a room and entertain, but I signed up to teach. They are completely numb. Like how many blue kits and cahoots did they just do in science? And then they've got to come to our music class and do some real deep practice, repetition over and over and over of the same thing. And it can be very boring for them. This teacher continues to say math on Chromebooks is insane. How about a paper and pencil? Every class uses screens. I teach music and they lose their minds if there isn't a video. It's exhausting. Another colleague said, it is important that young teachers learn to find their voices and learn to connect with kids. There are many ways to do this, but learning to have fun with them is one way. I don't think it's fair to say that encouraging active and engaging atmospheres equals dumbed down learning. Both can and should coexist and benefit each other. Of course, I completely agree with that comment. I just replied to that person that I actually didn't say that having fun is the issue. My post was not about having fun at all. So that was just kind of read into it. In terms of gamifying, gamifying is not the same as having fun. Gamifying is kind of like a technical education term. Absolutely, we should be trying to have fun as much as possible in class. But the way I think of that anyway, now this is just me saying my opinion, like we have fun because we're getting better. And sometimes that means the teacher needs to make a joke to lighten the mood because kids are tense and kids are frustrated because the work is hard. And if that's the balance of a master teacher, in my opinion, is how do we know when to lighten the mood? How do we know when to add levity? How do we know when to let them take a break because they've been just really, really working hard? Of course, those are nuances that I would never dream. I wouldn't even do a podcast about that because I'm not sure if I could explain that to someone for anyone other than me. Like everybody's personality as a teacher needs to figure that out on their own. So this comment is exactly right. Teachers do need to learn how to have fun with kids. My only concern is that when that fun replaces the pedagogy and gets also then inserted with this idea that as long as they're doing something and turning it in and clicking the buttons until they turn green, then that means they're learning. And of course, that's not the truth. This is an interesting question popped up here. I wonder what someone in class 50 years ago would think if they were transported to the many of the current classrooms. Would they be engaged or overwhelmed? In general, are we coddling current students or are we not being effective years ago? Now, my response is that question is not an either or. I imagine there was ineffective teaching 50 years ago. But I also believe that you can also look at data related to this kind of stuff and see how much literacy, basic English language literacy, for example, has declined in the last 50 years. So there is real concrete evidence that shows that we are not teaching as well on certain basic fundamental things as we were 50 years ago. And also we are coddling kids related to their expectations for entertainment, whose fault it is when they do bad stuff. Concepts like restorative justice, which I think is hugely problematic. It seeks to put victims in front of abusers in schools. And that's, again, something that sounds great until you read the literature. It just all kinds of things where it just takes the responsibility and kicks it down the road. And I think that is just one of many examples. Coddling of the American Mind is a great book. Go read it. That the data is there. We are absolutely coddling kids. And there is a difference between that and meeting them where they are. Because if I meet them where they are, the implication is that I'm going to meet them there and then immediately take them from where they are. Meeting them where they are can't mean they will just stay where they are, because then we are harming them. We're actually actively harming kids when we meet them where they are every day and never change that expectation. Another comment, you know what's fun? Not sucking. If coaches are allowed to coach hard, music teachers need to teach even harder. A superior high school director can outpace a mediocre college music department to a degree that kids can use those skills for their life. And their students who go on to get music degrees have a solid idea when they're teaching themselves. That's an interesting concept. There's another one that says, yes, we need to start placing some onus on students and families. Children need to come to school prepared to learn, and families need to partner in learning. I absolutely agree. Now, this is, of course, the brass tacks right here. Some teachers are arguing that if parents don't do this, we can't do anything about it. And I disagree. It does take both. It does take parents and it does take the school. But even in situations where kids are not getting this foundation at home, if we create an environment at our schools where this is expected and enforced, then yes, we can. We can be a sandbag in a storm, so to speak, for that kid where expectations and boundaries are still being met, at least for the 8 hours that they're at school. So I don't believe that we can just pass the buck as educators and say, well, heck, throw our hands up. If the parents aren't doing their job with this, there's only so much we can do. But it takes the whole school community. Now, this one I find to be very strange. It says, kids literally will not be engaged with something unless they're inspired to by a parent, teacher, mentor, or other type of influence. Teachers, parents, and the community all have roles to play in a child's development. Quit trying to pass the buck and take your part seriously. Now, first of all, that last part of the last sentence just was unnecessary. It was a dig, it was a jab, and I'm not really sure why. Of course, I take my job seriously. I do a whole podcast about it. So that wasn't really a fair comment. But let's talk about the first part he said. Kids literally will not be engaged, and then goes to list other adult external sources without those things. So what I hear there is kids have no agency. Kids have no self-starting capacity. Now, of course, that is demonstrably false. Of course, kids can start their own passion. Yes, they can. Now, is it nice when they have influences? Sometimes their influences, though, are negative, and they develop a passion and spark in reaction to the negative inspiration, so to speak. So this is just, I think, a terrible take, an absolutely terrible take to say kids, and this is actually part of the problem. So this person's opinion is part of the problem I'm criticizing, which is maybe why I got the dig that I got. And maybe he could tell that I'm criticizing something he holds dear, which is that students don't have agency. Students are completely reliant upon the adults in their lives to motivate them for learning. And I just don't think we can accept that. Another colleague simply said, how are we defining failing to engage? Which is a great question. I see it puts, the way I responded, I see it puts a lot of ways. When teachers get criticized, often by parents or administrators, about their failing or struggling students, sometimes it's summarized as, that teacher must not be inspiring enough, or building relationships enough, or being student-centered enough. Those are all good things for teachers to be, but it should be balanced with student responsibility. And what I mean by that is, how often does that conversation about what the teacher didn't do front and center before we've even had the conversation of what did the student not do? What did they do to avoid learning? What types of excuses did they make? How many classes did they skip? How many assignments did they not turn in? 20 years ago, when I started teaching, we would have had the student conversation first. And then if it looks like the teacher didn't follow some kind of policy or didn't follow some kind of rules of decorum, then maybe we would talk about the teacher's wrongdoing in that scenario. But that is completely flipped. We talk about, what did that teacher do wrong? Anytime the student is not doing well, that is toxic and it's got to stop. We put the responsibility on the students, because they are the ones there who are coming to get what we have. They're the ones walking in the door trying to get that information. And it is not a fair thing to place on students to say, or not a fair thing to place on teachers to say, well, they didn't want to learn it, then I guess you didn't pick the right stuff to teach. Now that's the customer service model again, and I don't think we can be sustainable in public education there. Another colleague points out that in her first professional experience in 2007, her supervising teacher said, "We have overstimulated kids in an understimulating environment." Now I think that's pretty dead on. That we have overstimulated kids who then come into an understimulating environment in relationship, though, to what they expect, which goes back to that dopamine addiction thing. And I think this is where most people are not on my wavelength when we're talking about this. We are framing this as if it's just like a cultural phenomenon. Guys, it is a chemical addiction. I'm going to keep bringing us back to that, because if we're talking about meth, then you wouldn't be telling kids to just meet them where they are, or telling teachers to just meet kids where they are. Well, they're meth addicted. Yeah, okay, we'll just meet them where they are. And if they need to do some meth, then you just let them do it. No. Now, this is not as dangerous as that, but the chemical pathways are the same. The addiction signs are the same. Now, we are providing a perfectly stimulating environment for a person who's not addicted to dopamine in most cases. So we need to fix that problem too. This is not just this is how the world's going now. Well, actually, the last couple of years is evidence that it doesn't have to go this way. These laws that are changing everywhere are indications that we can change these problems. If a technology is hurting people, we can be activists to fix the problem, which is kind of what I'm doing. And then finally, another teacher says, set high, realistic standards. They'll respect you for it. That's better than cheap dopamine any day. And I completely agree. That is well said. And I think it would be a good time for me to define cheap dopamine. Of course, what I mean by cheap dopamine is, because of course dopamine in and of itself is not bad. We would all be miserable, terrible creatures without dopamine. We need that in our lives. Cheap dopamine refers to the kind you can do through no effort, the kind you can inject by sitting there and doom scrolling until you see somebody like your post or whatever, where you'll get a shot of dopamine there. When somebody likes your post, you are getting an injection of dopamine, the kind that you don't have to deep practice for 2 weeks to get some kind of a payoff. That's what I mean by cheap dopamine. We want the kind of dopamine that kids have to work for that comes at a concert, for example. We want the kind of dopamine that comes at their first time where they were able to read the music by themselves with no help after the weeks and weeks of practicing and learning and working. We want the kind of dopamine that comes from tons and tons of attempts to sing a certain pitch or a vowel and have their voice crack. And then finally it just locks in and their muscles coordinate and everything just sounds glorious and they feel good and it sounds great and people get that. They get that audience reaction. We want, in music classes, we want their dopamine to come from that, because that is something that lasts, because they can think back and look at the process of being deprived of that stimulation and how it was worth it in the long run. And I think that's what we need to be teaching, and that's what we need to be enforcing in schools. And when I say enforcing, I mean that we set standards, we hold kids accountable for their behavior. And if they are acting like bored kids would, we don't justify it, because we're not saying, well, we're meeting where they are, or they're just products of their environment, or they're just doing what their parents say that they have to do at home. And no, we can't do anything about it. The school needs to be the place that they are held to that standard that this last comment said. High, realistic, so achievable, but high and ever moving forward those goalposts of what they can achieve. Anything less cheats kids out of the education that they deserve. I hope you found this episode interesting, or at the very least stimulating. I know that you probably heard some things you agree with, disagree with. So, of course, as always, head over to the Corolophers Facebook page. I'm going to post a lot of the questions and the prompts that I used at the beginning of the episode or earlier in the episode. And you can reply back to any or all or none of those over on the Corolophers Facebook page, and we can get some good conversation going about this, because it's an important topic. Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end of a conversation. If you are still hearing my voice, that means you're one of the MVPs, one of the diehards, one of the real ones, as the kids say. So if you are willing on the way out to check out a few different ways that you can help me continue to make this show high quality. One, use the promo code. That's the biggest one. At Sight Reading Factory, at mymusicfolders.com, at mychoirropes.com, at graphitepublishing.com, and endeavormusicpublishing.com. All of those take the Corolosophy checkout code. And of course, now the newest one is 3-Minute Theory. You can get a 15% discount when you enter Corolosophy at checkout there. And of course, going to Apple Podcasts and leaving a positive review is very helpful there, and sharing the episodes to your colleagues in real life and on social media. All of those things are incredibly helpful and allow me to continue to create this resource for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.